Hello, welcome to MJR RPG. The following review is of the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition scenario, None More Black, written by Brian M. Sammons, published in Chaosium's beginner keeper-oriented scenario collection, Doors to Darkness. As always, the first chunk of this review is largely spoiler-free, while the second half is completely full of spoilers. So I'll warn off players before getting into that. In short, this is a perfectly playable scenario with a very neat hook, but it does have the bones of something greater, just begging out to be beefed up and let loose a bit. After Servants of the Lake, which can be run almost entirely as is, None More Black is probably the second most complete scenario in the Doors to Darkness collection. Its scope is quite a bit larger than Servants, offering more freedom for player investigation and planning, as well as keeper improvisation, but it does slightly stretch the beginner-keeper focus. I'd argue it still is a fairly easy scenario to run, though it could use some more guidance and suggestions, as well as extra details to save newer keepers some unnecessary prep time. As a quick aside, I didn't realize until actually writing this review that the scenario is written by Brian M. Sammons, who I've been running quite a lot of lately. Forget-Me-Not is probably his biggest 7th EP, and has some similar strengths and weaknesses to this scenario here. But I've also been working through his 6th edition Secrets anthology, currently having run 11 Need and A Cult of One, both fantastic little scenarios. Sammons is quickly becoming one of my favorite Call of Cthulhu scenario writers, and I'm looking forward to writing more about his work. The scenario hook has the investigators looking into the apparent drug-related death of a Miskatonic University student, leading to some classic interview and pavement-stomping detective work. Compared to the tight locations of Servants of the Lake or the dungeon crawling The Darkness Beneath the Hill, None More Black's investigation is player-led and freeform, letting new keepers dip their toes into the standard open-form clue hunting of the usual Call of Cthulhu variety. There are lots of great moments and spooky bits to be found, and the overall theme and hook are great, but I can't help but feeling it's holding itself just a little bit back from being a really great overall scenario. 14 pages make up the scenario, including 2 pages of stats, a full-page art piece, a couple small handouts, another small insert piece, and a map. Despite being the final scenario in the book, and tied for my favorite alongside Servants, and one of the most open-ended, this is actually the shortest scenario by page count. This is partly down to having less artwork and large handouts compared to his sibling scenarios, but I also find the text to be oddly anemic, details-wise, in a few glaringly obvious places. For a beginner-focused freeform scenario, leaving out some simple NPCs the investigators are certain to talk to, or some extra but obvious investigation avenues, even bare-bones ones, is a bit of an odd choice. More experienced keepers can be expected to improvise a lot, those suggestions are still always appreciated, but you'd think scenarios specifically aimed at beginners would give some more support. Overall, though, None More Black is the scenario from Doors to Darkness that comes closest to being both a complete open investigation as well as a beginner keeper-friendly scenario. It plays well and can be largely run straight as written. My issues with it almost all come down to ways it could be improved, but most of those improvements are additions rather than outright alterations. I take this to mean the scenario's structure and mood are strong enough to inspire creativity and expansion compared to some of its sibling scenarios that, while maybe overall easier to run, do call out for some corrective surgery. None More Black can be found in Doors to Darkness, available directly from Chaosium, digitally on DriveThruRPG, or wherever else you get your RPG books. The following section is full of spoilers, so if you're a player or just don't want to know what's going on, I would suggest stopping here. With the mystery layer and investigation stripped away, the scenario is quite simple. For elaborate backstory reasons, a young man and Call of Cthulhu spooky sorcerer turned drug dealer, Jacob Dover, has been hooking Miskatonic University students on a cool new drug called the Black. The Black is, of course, Yib Tistill's blood. That's how I'm going to pronounce its name. I don't know how you're supposed to. And it doesn't react well with human biology for very long. With the latest dead student conveniently tied to the investigators, they're off to the races, tracking down Jacob Dover and eventually busting his grimy base of operations in an old slaughterhouse. The mystery layer complicates things some, and while having fun and moody bits to it, I do wish the investigation complicated things even more. From the first dead student, the investigators find hints to the Black, and from there can question other students and a bad element of addicts on campus, all of whom are unnamed, missing the opportunity to have one or more colorful NPCs, and saving work for the theoretical beginner keeper, this scenario is supposedly aimed for, and learn of a local dealer. Through more classic investigative hoops, they find the guy's address. How to confront the drug dealer or just search through his house for clues is a nice bit of open planning and decision-making for the investigators, but eventually they'll figure out where to find the spooky drug-cooking wizard, and from there the scenario can end in a big ol' open-ended raid. There are 3 fun optional complications suggested, but I think they should all be used to make the scenario properly dynamic, so not really optional in my book. In addition, there are a few interconnected aspects only briefly mentioned or awkwardly passed by in the text that I would bulk up to give the scenario more movement and avenues for investigators to pursue, influence, and be influenced by. Lastly, a ticking clock is sorely missing and can be easily added to give the scenario a push into a properly living sandbox. The first option, and easiest to add, is Seamus O'Shea, the most Irish mobster to ever be Irish. He's only given 2 paragraphs and a stat block, but he's great fun to have as a initial red herring and later a potential ally or rival, depending on how the investigators interact with him. He's there to also track down the source of the black, meaning he's on the same path as the investigators. As another aside, this could be a hook to tie Number Black to the Keeper Screen scenarios, Blackwater Creek and Missing Dues, if doing a mob-connected campaign, which is something I want to try now. That sounds fun. I find O'Shea and the mob behind him to be the most useful of the 3 original optional complications and probably the easiest to add on, as he has a clear motive and besides the investigators is the only real moving piece in an otherwise static scenario. The second option is really more of just a scene than a full-on extra moving piece, but it is to use the spooky wizard's little flying monkey helpers, a pair of, or more, of night gaunts, to kill an NPC of some importance to the investigators at some dramatic point. This is a very fun and kind of shitty move, but with a little foreshadowing of dark silhouettes vanishing from rooftops, and combined with the red herring of O'Shea also being a half-seen stalker, quite funny, suddenly having a helpful NPC, or even better O'Shea himself, be whisked away and dropped to their death can make for a great moment. And later they can do the same to an investigator. On the other hand, while mechanically fun to use, I think the night gaunts are lame and dip into my least favorite part of Call of Cthulhu and Lovecraftian horror gaming in general, using Lovecraft stories as bestiaries. Why does Dover the evil wizard have night gaunt servants? Because the scenario needs something spoopy for the investigators to shoot at, and the other overly abused common flying summon, Bayakis, are already used elsewhere in the book. A simple little change to break away a bit from the Lovecraft as monster manual, to emphasize the horror of the scenario and to avoid substantial rewriting, is to just use the night gaunt stat block, but replace them with addicts who have been completely changed rather than killed by the black. Getting a close-up view of one of the flying demons and realizing it's a mangled nightmare of one of the missing students that the investigators saw pictures of is creepy enough. And this is made worse if one of the investigators has tried the black and sees a portent of their terrible future. The final optional complication, and what I think should really be the actual centerpiece of the scenario, is the lovingly named raw head and black bones. Without this added, Dover just has some tanks full of the black, Yeeb to Still's borrowed blood. Mr. RHBB, pronounced Rob from here on, of course, on the other hand, has the black congealed into a terrible amalgamation of god blood and the leftover refuse of the slaughterhouse. As written, Mr. Rob is suggested to be used as a big bad monster, either an accident entirely out of Dover's attention and control, or as an extra guard dog for Dover. As a basic monster, Mr. Rob is very cool, if absurdly deadly and therefore kind of unusable outside of a screw you TPK button for a kind of mean keeper. A change to, once again, make the scenario more dynamic and emphasize the horror, would be to make Mr. Rob into the source of the black, as a summoned chunk of Eves Still's flesh, held captive against its will by Dover and his drug addict blackheads, to be milked for the drug. But maybe it could influence those who consume its blood, slowly making the blackheads, and most notably the changed night gaunts, carry out its will subtly to escape. Perhaps it clues into the investigators' motives and tries to bargain with them. Do the investigators trust the confused ramblings of the poor souls twisted by some unnatural drug, blathering about something trapped and being milked? And if Mr. Rob is freed, and it refuses to release the blackheads from its control, do the investigators realize they maybe unleash something even worse than Dover? Who knows? That's some complications. That's some choices. Ooh, that'd be fun. Or you can just have it as a big monster you gotta shoot a bunch. In addition to the 3 optional complications the text gives, I would also bulk up the police, university parents, and blackheads to give the scenario more texture and movement. As the scenario stands, these groups are only mentioned in passing and are completely static, despite being the main factions and victims affected by the Black and Dover. As with probably most Call of Cthulhu scenarios, the police are woefully underwritten. Despite presumably well-off university students in the 1920s dropping like flies, displaying obvious signs of suspicious deaths, their tongues are black, and cursory questioning revealing that they were all tied to a new drug trade, the cops have to be comically inept, to the point of suspicion to not be doing anything. To both explain away their lack of engagement while also making them into an active participant, I'd suggest 2 reasons. 1. Many of the richer parents of the deceased and drug-addled students have actively pressured the police to not investigate too deeply, wanting to avoid their family names and reputations being dragged through the mud of an illegal drug trade. 2. The last 2 or more detectives assigned to the case both had accidents, seemingly somehow fatally tripping on flat ground. The night gaunts got them, leading to the superstitious Arkham police wanting to avoid any more bad luck. A suitably frumpy and sweaty NPC detective assigned to the latest victim can be added as a point of contact, able to be persuaded to help, or could actively hinder the investigators, depending on their actions, or killed off by the night gaunts if the situation presents itself. Calling the cops in during the final raid can make for an action-packed, and hopefully less TPK-likely, finale, if the investigators have placated Detective Frump enough. The university itself is described as being in a panic due to the deaths, with administration racing to placate parents and students, and the students, of course, not being thrilled about their classmates dying around them. That's about it, though. As mentioned before, the silence of the parents of most of the victims could be chalked up to rich folk not wanting to be shamed by their wayward children, and this opens up an avenue of investigation, as the player characters could have some awkward conversations with a victim's parents, even to the point of blackmail to get more information. University staff could be caught in the middle, threatened by wealthy donors to avoid mentioning too much to the cops and newspapers, but likely pressured by students to do something, and so reach out to the investigators or hire their OPIs to deal with the issue. And that leads to the most uncomfortably and unfortunately underwritten part of the scenario, the blackheads. The addicts aren't given much thought or word space. Making these less bullet fodder and more actual people would go a long way to amplify the horrors of the scenario, as well as upping the stakes and giving the investigators more avenues for play. Simply giving the 1d6 plus 3 blackheads names and ages probably goes a long way to humanizing them. Even worse, if using my night gaunt suggestion, give a pair of them names as well. Maybe even have them, yell out for help like they can't control themselves during a fight. And if a fight does break out, the investigators could clearly see the conflicted look in their eyes, not wanting to fight but dragged along by the stranglehold Dover, or Mr. Robb, has on them. And finally, that leads into the ticking clock. Instead of just looking into the death of a vague acquaintance, the hook could be the disappearance of a student. As always, they could be a friend of the investigators, or could just be worried parents that aren't particularly concerned with their reputation who hired the investigators. This particular student fell on hard times, and Dover preyed on them. With other addicts turning up dead, or turning into night gaunts, it's only a matter of time until something horrible happens to this student. This also has the benefit of making a guns-blazing approach a bit less appealing, or at least more heavy of an option, as it can be difficult to identify someone in particular in the middle of a chaotic gunfight. With these optional complications added in, along with a few of my modifications, I think the scenario really comes alive. There's a more obvious time limit, multiple groups actively affecting the investigation in opposing ways, and therefore many more avenues for the investigators to pursue. Would this be more difficult for the keeper? Most certainly. But it moves most of the mental load from shuffling the investigators down investigative paths to how people, and potentially a certain Mr. Robb, act and react with the investigators. Even if run completely as written, in a static investigation format, I still find Number Black to be among the better, if not the best, scenario in Doors to Darkness, with lots of mood and opportunities for spooky moments, and player and keeper improvisation. As an added bonus, it's easily adapted to more modern time periods, and of course Delta Green. None More Black can be found in Doors to Darkness, available directly from Chaoisum, digitally on DriveThruRPG, or wherever else you get your RPGs. Thank you for listening. As always, credit to CryoChamber for use of their album, Cthulhu. Until next time, have a good one.